and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 45. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of bestseller The First 15 Lives of Harry August, and the 2017 Young Writer of the Year Award shortlister, The End of the Day. It's a fantastic book, that one. However, talking today about her latest book, Notes from a Burning Age. Hello, Claire North.
Hello.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. It's good to have you here. So, start with non-book specific questions here. Your first book as Catherine Webb was finished when you were 14 and published when you were 16. How did the publication come about?
Oh, that was a long time ago now. Let's think. I was very lucky in that I was born and raised in a bookish family. So my dad was a publisher and my mum was a writer and a ghostwriter and a copy editor. So they sort of knew how the industry worked. And when I wrote my first kind of stuff, you know, the stuff you write when no one's looking and you'll never see the light of day ever again. They're a bit like, yeah, you like writing, but nothing will come of it, but good on you. And then I wrote Mirror Dreams and they were like, oh, it's not as terrible as it should be. You still can't spell, but it's not actually that bad. And so on their advice, I sent it to a literary agent. Their specific advice was she'll take the time to read it and she'll take the time to tell you why she's not going to represent you, which is more than you can expect from a lot of people. So I sent it to this agent and she took the time to read it and then she also took the time to represent me. And she's been my agent ever since, and that has defined my career, really. So I got a very, very lucky and very privileged break early on in that my parents kind of knew who would give me the time of day. And yeah, after that, I've just kept scribbling, really.
That's fantastic. So how was the publicity? Obviously, we hear about adults going out to book launches and things like that. Were you able to do all the same sort of things as a teenage author?
It was a mixed bag. On the one hand, I think there was a certain amount of we need to protect this child, which is correct and good and ethical and the right decision to make. So while there was a lot of publicity, it was all quite soft publicity that centred on being young and this word that kept on cropping up, inspirational, which in my lofty age of 35, I find hilarious. There was a lot of media interest, but it was all somewhat shielded in a kind of, but let's not ask her to do incredibly difficult or complicated or anything hostile kind of work. So while there was a lot of it, it was quite fluffy. And I think my publisher walked quite a good line between using the advantage of having a young writer, but at the same time, giving me space to be a human being as well. I remember getting emails from my agent when I was 16 going, stop doing your edits and revise for your GCSEs. Again, I think it helped my parents who were in the industry and knew that at the end of the day, while there might be a lot of hype around the first book of a young writer, sooner or later I would grow old and hype passes, and therefore hype is not as important as passing your exams and having a plan.
Mm-hmm. You say the word inspirational. You're still inspirational today, though.
Oh, I don't. That's very kind of you. I feel creaky and old, but I'll take your word for it happily. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask on this because it's something that I've a bit of interest in myself, although mine is very school level and very, very long time ago. But as well as writing, you are a lighting designer and a self-defense instructor.
Yeah, that's right. Which bit is the bit that interests you the most?
No, I should have said that. The lighting designer, I believe.
Oh, yeah, let's nerd out about lights.
What do you do it for? Theatre?
I trained in theatre and I spent about 7-8 years doing almost exclusively theatre. So I studied at RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, which is known as the RADA by some people, and RADI-DA by the technicians. And I went from RADI-DA and did kind of technician work. I was at the National Theatre for a couple of years, but I was always interested in being a freelance lighting designer. And yeah, I did that for a while. And it's a very complicated and often quite abusive industry. And it's an industry that's got a lot of problems in terms of how it treats its technicians and a lot of its creatives. And it's still got a problem to a certain extent with women doing jobs that have been traditionally reserved for men. So I slowly began to move over to what I do mostly these days, which is music gigs. So I make flashy, flashy lights to music now, which is lovely.
A lot of fun. I am surprised that you said that it's a problem for women, a lighting designer. It doesn't strike you as something that would be.
It's changing. Even in the kind of 10 or so years since I first entered the industry, it has changed quite a lot. But in that way, that's very hard to specifically point out and say this person is being grotesquely sexist. Although I have had that. I have had people being grotesquely sexist. There is still a battle to prove your worth as a woman that men do not have to go through. I have worked for many years with lots of very affable men who are perfectly capable of doing their job, and that capability is rewarded and celebrated. If a woman comes along and is anything less than extraordinary, then that is not celebrated. You have to be better, more competent. You have to be more, I hate to use this word, but you have to be more ballsy. You have to prove yourself to a higher standard more consistently, I think, than a man in certainly the technical areas of it, lighting and sound, anything where people are like, oh, babe, can I show you where to plug that cable? There is this need, kind of this pressure to prove yourself. And if you don't prove yourself, because there's still not that many of us, you don't just get judged for yourself, which is how you should be judged, you get judged for your whole gender. And I have been guilty of seeing kind of women turn up in some of the venues I've worked and them not being as technically competent as I would have liked. Just as competent as a lot of perfectly average men, but not brilliantly competent. And I have felt myself judging them on behalf of a gender rather than as human beings. And it's still this slightly sickly, unpleasant undertow of disparity that can just grind you down and grind you down and grind you down. Theatre's not the only industry that has it, but technical theatre still does have some of it, and it is still quite a bitter fight in some ways.
That's beeping bonkers. Just, yeah. That's a topic I could talk further on, but we are here about your book. So, a brief intro to the book, and then we will get into the reading. Notes from a Burning Age is told by Ven, who is a spy in a post-apocalyptic world many years into the future, who is between two factions, the Temple, who preaches honouring the world, and they try to categorise digitalised information from what is our own age into things that are harmless or heretical. And then you've got the Brotherhood, who believe that humankind is the be-all and end-all, and so on. And it first begins in childhood when Ven is playing in the forest with Vey and Yui. We're going to talk about the pronunciation in a moment. But Claire, should we get to your reading first?
Yeah, cool beans. Let me put down my mug of tea, find a page. Right, here we go. This is the history of the Burning Age, as taught by Temple Scripture. There came a time when humankind had dominion over all the earth. With their might, they tore down the mountains and built cities there. With their wisdom, they conquered the seas and skies. Great medicine there was in abundance, and even their gods called humanity special, the chosen creature raised up above all things. For their children, they laboured to make a better world, and that world would be of man's making. Yet their children did not give thanks for the labours of their elders, and lo, the skies turned yellow, the air too dark to breathe from the workings of their industry. The cracked earth bled poisons, the sea rose and salted the land, and no wall of man could restrain it. In winter, the ice melted. In summer, the world burned. What shall we do? Asked the wisest of the burning ones. But mankind is stronger than Mother Earth and Father Sky, was the answer, and we do not flinch before the fire. And so the forests were felled, and the rain burned, and the flesh of babes and the rivers ran with lead, and still mankind did not turn from its course, not even when the deserts consumed the fertile plains, and the children themselves cried out for change. We are stronger than the storm, railed the greatest of the burning ones. Weakness is the child's error. It was about the time of the great migrations, when all the nations began to splinter like the burning bough, and the wars of water and grain came upon the land, that the kakuy woke. First they rose from the skeletons of the ocean reefs, glistening bones and acid breath. Then they climbed from the shattered mines, and their eyes were embers of coal, and their feet broke the towns beneath their feet. Then they came from the sky itself. Upon thunder and lightning they blazed, tearing down the monuments of man and bidding the earth swallow whole the sacrileges of the burning age. The arrogant tried to fight back, as if their weapons were not forged of the same earth which now they sought to harm. They perished beneath the kakuy as the mouse in the eagle's claws. Those who survived fled to the last of the forests and the sacred hidden places, their 1,000 tongues blending into new language, their ancient ways changing as does the scudding sky. From their prayers, Temple was born. The scattered people raised their hands to the falling rain and said, "No more will we confront sky and earth as enemy. Henceforth we shall give thanks to she that carries us. The sun will rise and the sun will set, and we will walk within this changing life as creatures of this world, born within her womb." And at last, hearing their prayers, the kakuy turned their wrathful eyes from the remnants of humanity and left the tribes in peace. Where the great spirits walked, the land grew anew. Where they laid their heads, fresh springs rose from the barren mountain. And as the forests grew, so in time the peoples of the world grew again, venturing forth as once their ancestors had, to carve a new world from the ashes of the old. We spread across the land and gave thanks for the harvest and the kakuy, who, their work complete, return to the hidden places of this world to rest once more between sky and earth. Let not your hands fell the tree, but that another is planted. Let not your ears hear the rain and think it falls for you. Let not your tongue speak of conquering the mountain, for it will not shiver when winter comes. And if your eyes should see the kakuy slumbering in their sacred caves, gentle in rest, remember to bow in prayer, for should they wake again, no tears shall douse the flames. This is the teaching of the temple on the history of the Burning Age. In deference to the scholars and priests who penned it, most of its lies stem from ignorance and omission, and the rest are at least well-intentioned, all things considered.
We're going to completely abandon my bullet point list of questions, at least for a moment, because when we were talking before we pressed record and I was asking you about the pronunciation of various words and names, you said that you could tell us about the book in terms of colour and things like that. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So it turns out you pronounce kakuy, I think, but I might be wrong. There's lots of words in the book that are a mishmash of different languages and cultures on the basis that there's been mass migration and we've all got a bit smidged together. And I've had people, including the astonishingly excellent audiobook reader Peter Kenny, ask me how do you say these things? And my honest answer is I very rarely have any idea whatsoever. I don't really hear words when they're written on the page as an audible thing. I can hear them as colour and I can hear them as like a physical object. Like some words have weight, some words are triangular, some words are circular, some words are purple or green or blue. And like this has driven my editor mad over the years. So I've got editor queries kind of going, this sentence doesn't quite work. Have you considered this? And I'll write back going, but the problem with that change is it's too red. And that is kind of how I experience language, which is massively unhelpful in so many ways. Sorry about that.
No, it's actually really helpful, I think, to know that, having read your book and applying kind of my own interpretations to what you say and then applying all this to the book itself. It really opens it up in a new way.
Yay, well, then I don't apologise. Thank you.
No, don't apologise. But do let more people know if they ask, definitely. But I am glad you had a conversation with your audiobook narrator because he does need to know how to pronounce these words.
Yes, my conversation was really useless with him. I was like, Peter Kenny, you are more skilled at language than I am in this particular regard, and in probably many, many others. I trust you to make everything better with your voice, because he does. That's a very lucky position to be in when you can say that, but genuinely, he's really, really good.
Brilliant. How would you categorise this book genre-wise?
That's really difficult. My publisher informs me that it is post-apocalyptic, and I believe the tagline they use is something like the inverse of dystopia, which you'd think is utopian. And I'm a bit like, that was the ambition. The ambition was to try and look at the consequence of climate change, but in a utopian, we're building a better world kind of way. Me being me, I've thrown in a spy thriller and a war because I do love me some narrative and some plot. And because utopian doesn't necessarily sound as mass market appeal, I guess, as dystopia. So whatever that genre is, whatever the genre is that isn't dystopian, but isn't utopian, but is kind of utopian, and is sort of post-apocalyptic, but not in a eating cans of dog food on the side of the road while being hunted by humans who are worse than zombies way. Maybe it's just a spy thriller. Let me stop right there. Maybe it's just a spy thriller. Who knows?
Well, I know I fell when I was trying to think of how to describe something for a question that I don't think we need anymore because you've answered the question through the colour. I was thinking post-apocalyptic.
Yeah. So a lot of the problem I think we have with books, particularly which deal with environmentalism and climate change, is we always talk about it in terms of everything has fallen apart, the world is a desert, Mad Max is eating two-headed lizards, and despair is everywhere, which, while a fascinating narrative trope that allows you to tell brilliant and amazing stories, particularly Mad Max Fury Road, let's be clear here, while that's great, despair is never as good a motivation for action as hope. And so I think there is a need to tell more stories about, yes, the disastrous and complicated times we're living in, but with the motivation of hope and change and a future that we can imagine where we aren't having to eat dog food. And that still technically, I think, falls into the post-apocalyptic category in as much as bad things have happened to get there. But post-apocalyptic usually does carry this weight of everything is diabolical forever.
Mm-hmm. Well, is part of what you're saying here the reason why you chose to use this futuristic world to explore the themes as opposed to like what's happening today?
Yeah. I think if you look at what's happening today, A, it's a terrible, complicated mess, but also B, it's very hard to tell a story about creating a future in an imaginative way unless you're just willing to do that. Like, fundamentally, we're not just having conversations about what do we do now, we're having conversations about what is the world we want to build. And one of the joys and the privileges of science fiction, one of the reasons it's one of the best genres ever, is you get to actually tell that story emotionally rather than just in terms of hypothetical graphs and statistics. And I think there's a privilege in being able to do that. There's a real privilege in being able to go, well, let's try and forecast, and again, I hate to use this word, maybe even inspire conversations about a future that could be better. It's arguably a tradition that Star Trek nailed for a very, very long time, of going, wouldn't it be lovely if we were nice to each other as the future? That got complicated, but there is a glorious history, I think, of science fiction, not just forecasting doom, but attempting to inspire optimism.
And you're using sci-fi. It's a sci-fi novel then, it's not a thriller.
I don't know what it is. Oh no, is it a spy thriller? Is it dystopian? I don't know. It's a great big messy mishmash. And in my defense, most books are a great big messy mishmash. The conversation about what genre is could take up even more time than us geeking out about lights.
It's a Claire North novel.
That's the tag right there, isn't it?
So we've talked about the world. So let's go to, you've got these two sides of the argument about climate and how the world's going to move on. And your novel's very good at showing the bad in the good and the good in the bad. So it's quite interesting because sometimes you're thinking, which one am I meant to be rooting for here? You know, which side? Where do you fall on the subject yourself in terms of the two sides of the argument, the Temple and the Brotherhood specifically?
Oh, I mean, as a human being, I'm a fluffy, wuffy, wishy-washy environmentalist, Green Party, card-carrying, feminist, socialist, let's tax the rich and honor nature, fluffy person. Like, yeah, I'm wearing the badge that says let's save the planet. I'm straight up and down. There's very little complicated about my feelings on this topic. I think the only reason that I've written The Brotherhood with any particular sympathy is because fundamentally, if you're going to tell stories about humans, then you need to tell stories about why humans do the things they do. And if you look at the 20th and the 21st century, you need to ask yourself the question, why, given we've known since before the 1970s that human action is causing climate change that literally endangers the species, why do we keep doing the things we do? And it is dishonest and it is dishonourable to be blasé in your answer to that question. It is dishonest and dishonourable to say, oh, because of stupid or maliciousness or evil or whatever simple black and white term it is you want to say. Fundamentally, humans 99.9% of the time do the things they do because they are trying to build a better world for their children, because they do have ideals, because they do believe they're doing the right thing. It just so happens that in the case of the Brotherhood and in the case of certainly a lot of the industry of the early 21st century that still won't decarbonize, doing the right thing and the ideology that drives that is fundamentally flawed. But there is an emotional truth there and there is a fundamental humanity there that you cannot dismiss. Particularly as a writer, it is your job to honour humanity. Even if politically you disagree with the actions that humanity takes, your job is still to see the human being beneath that.
Well, that's interesting then. I mean, I don't necessarily want to say, you know, what religion are you, what faith, that's, you know, neither here nor there. But it's interesting that you have chosen something that's so controversial in a way, a faith, a belief, although it's different to ours, to be the right side and kind of have it so, not black and white, but definitely divided and separated.
Well, firstly, I'm atheist, just to help there. Secondly, the thing with the temple is I would say they're not necessarily what you'd call an organised religion or a faith or belief. They sit, I think, in that somewhat wishy-washy place where the Buddhists do, of, is this an organised religion? Yes, to a certain extent, absolutely, depending somewhat where you are in the world, actually. But also, is this a thing that does not have a primal moving God? Is it a complicated tangle? Yes, that too. And temple fundamentally in the book exists to go, if we screw around with the planet, the kakuy will wake, which, unlike other organised religion, there is categorical empirical proof to say is true. Fundamentally, if you screw around, you will end up in trouble. There is a provable truth behind everything they do. And yes, they have ritualized that process. They have turned that very basic reality into a story, and they use that story to shape culture and conversation. But that's no more than anyone else does ever, I think, in society. And if anything, I think if we talk about environmentalism, what's interesting about it is that it achieves arguably some of its greatest successes when it too is turned into a story. If you look at the world, we've known forever the statistics of the ice caps are melting, everything is going to pot. But what we report in our newspapers is Greta Thunberg being a flipping heroine, which is amazing. She is, but we latch onto the story. And a lot of people kind of go, oh, climate change fanatics, oh, fundamental religion. You actually know what's happening here is stories have power, and how you tell that story can have huge impact on humanity. And I think in many ways, all Temple is doing is taking the stats and the graphs and the statistics and the reality of do not set fire to the coal mine, you will be stomped on by a giant mountain-sized angry spirit. It's taking that truth and making it a ritualized story.
You've made me think of a different question that I suppose I'll bring up in a minute. You saying about Greta Thunberg and stuff, and how it's stories, definitely, and also individuals, because it focuses it.
Yeah, that's one of the other great flaws in all human action ever. We spend a lot of our time looking for heroes, which is a wonderful narrative trope. It's brilliant, but it can also be a very depowering trope. In as much as a lot of the times they're going, oh, it's all right. The CEO of Apple will save us. Elon Musk will come up with the technology. Someone will come up with a thing to make everything better. Like, actually, fundamentally, what's going to save us as a species is collective action. But that, again, doesn't make for a story. We like heroes. We like clear narrative lines from A to B with a nice emotional payoff on the way. Collective action is not very sexy. And again, I think one of the interesting things, if we talk about Temple as a religious object in the book, is I've tried to go out of my way to ask the question of, well, how do you organize collective action? And say what you will for organized religion, it is very good at collective action, telling a single story. It is very good at, again, using ritual and narrative to bring about collective change.
Well, what we're saying is making me think of Venn, and I was going to ask you about him anyway, but what we're saying is informing this question better. So you've got Venn, he's both a part of the action, but also kind of not. He spends a lot of time in thought. There's a certain distance there, as said, that I felt could also be applied at times between him and the reader, you know, another thing that kind of makes it distant and not. What was it about his position as a character in the book, in the story, in the place, that made him a good person to narrate?
I have always had a soft spot for characters who are close enough to the action that it will affect them emotionally and they will be forced to engage with it in some meaningful way. However, I have increasingly, let's not kid ourselves, moved away from your straight up and down hero who is the chosen one who will make things better. And I have done that. It's been lots of fun. But in recent years, I've moved further and further away from that towards people who are being swept up and trying their very best. This has had mixed consequences. Again, I think my editor has been very frustrated with me in the past with books like The End of the Day, whose main character is Charlie, whose job is the harbinger of death. Technically speaking, he doesn't actually have a huge amount of agency, but he is there literally forecasting the imminent arrival of his employer, Death Incarnate. Or in 84K, the main character is a guy called Theo, whose job it is to essentially be a civil servant who audits the value of your crimes. And he doesn't have a huge amount of agency, but is trying his best under difficult circumstances. And my publisher, again, I think with an eye to how much we as a society love heroes, has always been a bit like, but wouldn't it be great if these people made bigger choices? But the reality of our lived experience, I think, for, again, most of us alive right now, is that we don't have that power. And that is in and of itself fascinating. How do you live a life, a meaningful life, an ethical life, a life that matters to you emotionally, and maybe indeed a life that you feel impacts the world around you, when the reality is most power is in a very small number of hands? And it's a difficult story to tell well and tell in an emotionally satisfying way, but it is a perpetually interesting story. And when you're dealing with big stuff like climate change, or in the case of 84K, neo-capitalism and how it be bad, or in the case of The End of the Day, death and how it be complicated, like when you're dealing with big stuff like that, stuff that is literally the definition of beyond your control, how do you tell stories that are emotionally engaging, but also capture that disparity between the vastness of what's going on around you and a meaningful lived experience? That was a long, waffly answer, and I'm not going to pretend I have nailed that skill at all. I'm trying my best. Goodness, it's hard. But it's interesting. If nothing else, it's interesting. I'll keep on beavering at
it. Well, I mean, get nominated for awards. You know what you're doing. You know what you're saying. It's fine.
That's very kind.
You're kind of saying, we're talking about like regular people effectively. I mean, I think it was Charlie worked in an office or something before death came to him. I think that was where he was.
Yeah, I can't actually remember what he did. I got 8 out of 10 on a quiz on one of my own books once, so I'm the wrong person to ask. But yeah, and death worked out of Milton Keynes. It was all very, Midland Railway.
I loved the slight Terry Pratchett thing there. It was great. Sorry, listeners, we'll go back to this book. But yeah, I mean, then he's not a regular person in terms of what he does. I mean, what he does is extraordinary. But at the same time, he is kind of a regular person. He's not someone at the top. Does this whole thing extend to UA?
So these are good and tricky questions. I think with Vane's relationship with UA, so without wanting to say too much about the book and spoil too many things, there are multiple characters engaged in a game of cat and mouse on various different sides. And one of the characters Ven is sort of close to in a slightly complicated childhood friendship, complicated way, is Yue. He was in a very different position to him. But even then, I think her position is one of hidden power. She's not the general. She's not the big politician. She's not what in Theatreland I think we would call show critical. There's this phrase you get a lot in theatre. You're like, okay, we need to put on the show and it's Hamlet. Do we need a skull? Yes, that's probably show critical. Do we need spangly shoes? No, that's probably not show critical. None of these people fall into the category of show critical people. And I think that that's also quite an interesting thing to write. And I don't think Yue is, in that sense, show critical. But again, what's interesting about reality as well as fiction is how the world is made up of people who are not show critical. None of us can really turn around at any given moment and say, oh, we're the heroes. My downstairs neighbour, sorry, it's a massive tangent, but stick with me. My downstairs neighbour is a psychiatric nurse who started working in a COVID ward in the height of the pandemic. And he'd come home sometimes at the height of when we were clapping for NHS workers rather than giving them a pay rise or PPE. And he'd be like, I'm not a hero. I'm just turning up and doing my work. And you'd kind of turn around and go, well, no, technically speaking, you are a hero. And you'd go, no one would notice if I wasn't there. But the world is full of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, millions of people who on an individual basis can turn around and say, the world wouldn't notice if I wasn't there, but without whom the world stops entirely. Does that make sense? I have no idea if that makes sense, but I hope it does.
Entirely. It makes sense entirely.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yes. And while he may not say he's a hero, thank you to your neighbour. If I may say that, thank you, obviously, from everybody.
He'll be very smug to know that. He'll be smug and confused.
So you said about with theatre non-critical. I'm going to go to the extremes here with what you're saying. Could you tell your books, and we'll concentrate on Notes from a Burning Age, but could you tell your fiction without the characters and just have an unnamed narrator or maybe kind of yourself through the first person?
Well, you need characters to have an emotional heart. You need characters to have an emotional development. You need characters to have a story. You could write a book of beat poetry about a utopian future in which everything is great. But fundamentally, there's still a character behind that beat poem, and that character is you. There's a first-person narrator who is invested in convincing you to have an emotional response to this. I have no skills at beat poetry. My skills lie in telling stories through books. And the craft of that is the craft of narrative and the craft of feeling and the craft of humanity. And by definition, therefore, for me personally, based on the skill set I have, there has to be a human heart beating at the heart of it. And that should be characters unfolding stories that hopefully make you care, which I think is a long way of saying that I don't think I'm a complicated or rich enough character to put at the centre of my books. I think there are way more interesting human hearts and human experiences out there than mine. And I'd much rather engage with those.
Fair enough. You've got the kakuy in the entire novel, obviously. and they are a big part of it. And then I know I got to the end, and absolutely wonderful ending that really ties it up. And at the same time I went, no, I suppose you hadn't been obvious, you hadn't been blunt about what the kakuy are. Are they open to interpretation?
I hope they're open to interpretation. I've gone out of my way to keep them open to interpretation. And I would argue that even Ven, who is, as the main narrator, someone who has the most engagement with them, even after the end of the book, he's not unwilling to turn around and go, well, maybe I saw the kakuy, or maybe I saw this massive geothermal effect that could also be explained. So I've tried my very best to keep open to interpretation. I think that there is a lovely quirk of human psychology, a very useful quirk of human psychology, which essentially is confirmation bias, which as an evolutionary thing is fantastically useful, because it means that if you are Ugg the caveman and you have learned quite early on that saber-toothed tigers are bad, when you next encounter a thing that looks a bit like a saber-toothed tiger, but might actually be a fluffy kitten, your bias will kick in and go, that be saber-toothed tiger, run away, arg. And while this is a limiting thing that prevents you from getting a fluffy kitten, it is also a thing that saves your life. That human bias extends into all life ever. If we wish to believe in miracles, if we wish to believe in magic, if we are scared of something, if we adore something, if we want something to be true, if we want something not to be true, human bias will almost invariably kick in to increase the probability that we'll say this is so, partly to save our lives, partly because it's just faster than slow cognition. And I think you could argue, certainly in the case of the kakuy, that in terms of who sees them and who talks about them and their relationship with the book, yeah, it could very well be that they are a real and powerful and potent force. It could very well be that they're open to interpretation, and that was my aim, and I have no idea if I achieved it, but I gave them my best punt.
So can it be assumed that you have no definitive answer yourself as to what they are?
I go out of my way to have very few definitive answers on anything I write ever, having learned a long time ago that I can have very strong opinions about my books and then meet readers who tell me that I am mistaken, and they are just as right as I am. And that is both the glory and the wonder of books, but also a good sharp lesson to any authorial ego.
Brilliant. No, fair enough. So has anyone come to you and said what they think then? It is a new book, I know, so.
It's quite fresh out of the gate. My editor, when she does come to me with queries, the queries tend to be, I think you're trying to do this, but it is possible you're trying to do that. Do you wish to clarify this? And if you don't wish to clarify it, do you wish to clarify why you're not clarifying it? Because, not to put too fine a point, my editor, the amazing Anna, is phenomenal, and I love her more than words can possibly express.
Fair enough. So we've kind of gone towards this question. I'm going to bring it in now. So, I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about too much at all, I think, actually, the thing that I loved was the way you've got the information from the past and it's been preserved and sorted through. It's all in servers, it's all digital, and people are having to translate it from what is our current languages and translate it into their languages. They have no idea what our language is doing. And these things could sometimes be very political. They could be instructions on how to make nuclear weapons. And sometimes they're like cat photos and pictures of people's lunch. That's why I've remembered it, because you mentioned a fluffy cat. I wondered if there was a religious influence here, the creation of the Bible, for instance, or something. Or if not, what led you to create these servers of information and this whole idea?
I think that the information thing, firstly, it's a very unoriginal theme in lots of science fiction. From Canticle of Leibowitz onwards, science fiction is full of people digging up information from the past and going, oh, that's interesting, let us analyse our ancestors. Because as tropes go, it's your standard, the future looking back at the present day and making judgments about the present day in a way that allows us to comment in a socioeconomic way on who we are now. That box is now ticked. So it's not an original thing, it's not an original trope, it is just a useful trope. But I think from a narrative point of view, it seemed logical that archaeological evidence of this era would survive. And it seemed logical that significant amounts of data from this era would survive just because we produce so much of it. Goodness, we're churning out a digital footprint, aren't we? Which is not a problem. Good on us, even though most of it is cat photos. I love a cat photo. It seemed impossible that there wouldn't be tracery of us and the world that had gone before. And if that is almost inevitable common sense truth, the question then becomes, what do you want to do with that information? And I've had people kind of go, oh, this is a book about working out what information is valuable, which is not what I intended it to be, but as established, again, what I intended it to be is not the be-all or end-all of a book. But asking the question of how do we as a society relate to information is at least mildly more interesting. So, little tangent, I hope you don't mind, but I studied history before going off to be a lighting designer, and history is essentially the study of 10 people with 10 different opinions on every single thing that's ever happened in the world ever, all of whom can say categorically, yes, there was this event, and then they disagree in every possible way about how or why or what happened next. And it is the study of bias and human interpretation around things that you thought were fact until you realize that it's not, because it's all being told by humans to humans in human ways. And I think that that's more interesting than just data about nuclear reactors or, you know, interpretations of Instagram accounts found from the past. I think the fact that you can see humans interpreting things is endlessly fascinating. And again, when you kind of, if you look at stuff like climate change, a lot of the narratives around climate change have either been people going, oh, it's not real, because that's a comforting lie. It's comforting to think that this is a thing beyond our control in a way. It's terrifying, but it's also, there's a certain godlike mystique to it. Or it's been people going, well, it's real, but we can't do anything about it, so why try? And what's fascinating is we have the data, but then the stories and the interpretations around the data have kept us bogged down for decades. I think that's interesting. The facts are facts. Climate change is real. It is reversible. We can do everything we need to do right now. That is a fact. And a bit like the archaeologists in Burning Age digging up facts, what's interesting is not the data in the spreadsheet. What's interesting is the stories about what we do with that and the stories we tell ourselves about that and how we then act.
Well, I'm going to go to this question. Have we the power, do you think, to reverse the burning age that we're at the beginnings of?
Yeah, 100%. Like 100%. Just again, scientific fact. I'm glad you asked, she says in an exciting environmentalist green and fluffy way. We're not at the beginning of it. It's in full swing ahead. We've already passed 1.5 degrees. But the good news is we have everything we need to stop it. And we've had it for a while. We have access to clean, renewable energy. It is cheap to manufacture. It is free, basically, to run. We have access to technologies that will save the planet. We know precisely how to have a sustainable agriculture that is tasty and fulfilling and will keep the entire population happily fed. We can do everything right here, right now, and the sooner we act, the cheaper it will be. We have the technology, we have the know-how, we can build a better society while doing it. Wouldn't it be lovely if we actually started taxing the 1% who own 40% of all the UK's assets and using some of that money to build, I don't know, local light transport in the north and better schools and lovely community projects and green spaces for everyone. Goodness, yeah, we can fix it. We just need to embrace this one fundamental truth that we can do it. It will be great if we do it. We have the power right now, and there is only a tiny, tiny sliver of power and vested interests that are preventing genuinely empowering action that could help build not just a healthy, safe world, but like just a better world of equality and fluffiness and justice. And dude, you can't see me flopping back in my chair, but we can do it. We can do it. And, oh, goodness, I hope we do.
Yeah, it's irritating because we can do it, but the regular person can only do so much, and we need the say-so, we need the decisions to come from the top as well.
Yeah, but the regular person can get out and vote.
That's true.
You can get out and vote. You can vote for green policies right now. And though individual lifestyle changes, which are perfectly easy to do and perfectly nice, though you may not feel like your individual lifestyle changes are having a huge impact on the carbon footprint, because ultimately, I'm not going to lie, your individual lifestyle change will not have a huge impact on the carbon footprint. The more of us do it, the more we don't merely communicate to each other that this is possible, but the more our collective action becomes an inspiration to others and becomes a living proof of the world we want to make. You can go out right now as an individual and start making choices about the life you want to live and the community you want to build. And actually, if everyone believes that that's possible, if everyone believes that there is hope, then it doesn't matter how hard Boris Johnson tries to fight back against reality. You, as an individual, have made the difference and can make the difference. And I tell you this, dear listener, in genuine belief that it is through hope, not cynicism, that we will change the world together. And together includes and must have you.
Have you ever considered a life in politics?
I have stood for local council for the Green Party several times. I would be a terrible councillor. That's not my election pitch, I hasten to add. I just think I'd be a terrible councillor, because a lot of local council is about interacting in a really kind of honest, open and supportive way with your local community about stuff like dog fouling and local drainage and things that are really important, but I do not have the mentality to handle well. I mean, please do vote for me next time I run, but also, oh goodness, there are so many better, more passionate community support people out there who deserve your vote more.
Going back to the book, we're going to go back to the tangent that you made. I'm going to stay with the tangent. It's a few questions back now, but I think it needs to be covered still. What is the period of history you enjoy studying the most?
Ooh, that's a lovely question. At LSE, I specialised in early modern, mostly the 1600s, and also the Cold War. And if you can detect a lot of the Cold War in this book, then yes, I loved the Cold War. These days, I'm trying to learn more about the English Civil War, because it's somehow a bit of the 1600s that, despite being literally my own backyard, slightly passed me by and is fascinating. But also, again, if you're talking about massive societal change, we do have to remember that England had a civil war in which for a few years we decided to not have a king, which, when you think about the context of mass social movements these days, is already remarkable. So I'm currently enjoying reading about the English Civil War, love a 1600s soldier in a floppy hat, and everything about studying that period.
Fantastic. We'll move on because I could ask more questions there, but a couple more questions on the book. This is possibly going to sound completely outrageous, but bear with me on this. Could Ven ever have become a proper Brotherhood member?
Oh yeah, I reckon so. I reckon we all could. At the end of the day, the line between believing you're doing the right thing in a fluffy, let's all root together for the environment, and believing you're doing the right thing in a harsh, we must close the borders and protect what resources we have, is very, very thin. It both comes from the same place. I am a fluffy lefty environmentalist who believes that we need to do everything we possibly can to create a safe and breathable world. And I do this because I want to protect my family, I want to protect my friends, I want to protect my community. I could easily say, well, the world is in trouble, so what we need to do is shut down the borders, close ourselves off, resign ourselves to living in bomb shelters the rest of our lives. And that too would come from a place of wanting to protect my family, wanting to protect my friends, wanting to protect my community. It's a very fine line that comes from a very similar place of, again, humanity, of wanting the best for the ones you love. I had a wonderful interview with a gentleman who specialises in cults, turned around and said something along the lines of, if you think that you are never going to join a cult, you are the perfect person to be recruited because your mind is already made up. And I think that's a very telling insight into humanity. We are all of us, at any given moment, I think, a few seconds away from becoming someone we didn't think we were in the name of being someone we want to be.
That's a fascinating quote. I mean, the thing that made me think of this question is just this like one little sentence or two sentences where you have Ven thinking about things as he does, and he is saying about his ancestors, us being, and I quote, so clever and so powerful, which when you've read about him being an inquisitor and trying to stop the Brotherhood, it's just kind of like, what? Hang on a minute. So what you've said there about the cults and the balance and everything, it's very true, and it's something to think about.
Thank you, I think. Yay.
So I'm going to move on to the future, although not the dystopian future that we have. What's next in terms of your writing? And I say this full well acknowledging that you've just published this book.
Thank you. What's next is a top secret trilogy that I am not yet allowed to talk about. I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to say it's a trilogy, but hey, that's now happened. I am halfway through writing the second of that series of books. My computer exploded and took 45,000 words of it with me a few months ago, which was a definite low point. But it's picked back up. I spent a week eating ice cream from the tub and feeling sad for myself, and now it's back on course. So yeah, I'm writing a top secret trilogy that is top secret, annoyingly. I'm really sorry.
That's fine. Very intriguing. And I mean, if it's a thriller, then it's a perfect answer. Who knows?
It's sort of geopolitical with a bit of historical. The main narrator for book one spends a lot of time threatening people with genital warts. We'll see what happens.
Okay, so yeah. All right, so I'm seeing some potential comedy there, but I'm not in a place to comment. Who knows? Cool. So, listeners, links to purchase Notes from a Burning Age are in the episode description. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider reviewing. You can do so on iTunes, Podcast Addict, and Podchaser. Claire, this has been brilliant having you on. You've brought up things that I had no idea we were going to bring up, and as I said, my bullet point list is all over the place. We've just had a completely different conversation than I expected, but it's also just been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Sorry about the bullet points, but it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Join me on Monday the 27th of October when I will be joined by Hazel Gaynor, author of The Bird in the Bamboo Cage, which is also known as When We Were Young and Brave. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 45, was recorded on the 27th of August and published on the 13th of September 2021. Music and production by Charlie Place.